Hello and welcome to Local Government Information Unit's Fireside Chats. This is an interview series for our Future Local Lab programme where we're joined by guests from around the world to discuss what the future holds for local government, with the emphasis firmly on what the sector can do now to start preparing for the future. I'm Paolo Vestri, I'm the Content Commissioner for Scotland at LGIU. Today I'll be facilitating a discussion between David Marlow and Professor James Mitchell, two LGIU associates and experts in UK local government, as they discuss the state of local government in England and Scotland in 2025, what they think the future may hold for innovation in the sector, and the lessons each country could learn from one another. James and David, thank you for joining us. Can you kick off by setting the scene for viewers and each quickly explain your experiences in the world of local government? James, do you want to kick off?
Well, I'm an academic, so I've not got any kind of practical experience in the way that David has. I've been studying local government as part of the kind of interest in public policy that I have for about 40 odd years. I mean, I first started doing that as an undergraduate, as a student of John Sewell, Lord Sewell, who was then the president of COSLA, and my interest has been retained ever since. I've done work with COSLA, with Solace over the years, and I've been on various commissions and inquiries and such like, but I come at it more as an outsider and certainly not as a practitioner.
Okay, thanks, James. And David?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a development economist, in fact, professionally. I had about 25 years senior public service career, both in the UK and overseas. The last 8 of that was as a chief exec, first of a large metropolitan council in England, and then latterly of a regional development agency. The last 10 or 15 years, I've actually worked in research and consultancy. I certainly don't have the academic credentials of James, but I am a visiting professor at Newcastle University, and I guess I've tended to focus on devolution, particularly on local inclusive growth, on anchor institution collaboration, multi-tier working, and the areas around that.
Great, thanks very much, and a massive wealth of experience between the two of you there. So, can I start off by asking you? Both of us have been involved in or seen commissions and working groups come and go, both in England and Wales, from the Mackintosh Commission to the Christie Commission in Scotland, and many English public sector reform proposals over the last couple of decades. Can you identify common themes and share a light on what these proposals have delivered for local government, highlighting in particular what was ignored and not implemented, and perhaps touching on why these recommendations have not been implemented? James, do you want to kick off from the Scottish perspective?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to Mackintosh, that was, of course, a report that was produced with devolution in mind. Neil Mackintosh was asked by Donald Dewar to kind of look at the relationship between the Scottish Parliament and local authorities. And of course, prior to devolution, relations had turned pretty sour in between central and local government in Scotland. And the anticipation of devolution, well, it was expected that there would be improved relationships and that there would be a kind of empowered local authorities. And I guess the kind of key themes in that report, I mean, a report that produced about 32 different recommendations, but the key themes were there needed to be mutual respect and parity of esteem. The local authorities were vitally important in delivering public services. They were vitally important because they gave the public an opportunity to vote as well. And the idea was that we would kind of have a very different kind of relationship. And I guess ever since then, some of the recommendations were actually implemented, but many weren't. But I have to say, I think looking back over that period and taking account of the kind of key themes of mutual respect, parity of esteem, that just hasn't happened. I mean, that hasn't happened. There's been an onward march of centralisation, of uniformism in Scotland, and despite various attempts to reform and suggestions that we should reform, I mean, various inquiries and such like over that period of time, I think I would point particularly to finance and the kind of way in which centralisation has marched ever onwards in terms of finance. The Scottish Government essentially controls local government in a way that would have been almost inconceivable pre-devolution. And it is kind of ironic that many who came to support a Scottish Parliament from local government did so in the expectation that things would be very, very different. None of them, I think, back then could have anticipated, well, some did actually, in fairness, some did anticipate that things would go wrong. wrong, but, things like council tax freezes and, ring fencing and so on and so forth, the relationship has become even more imbalanced. And, central government has very much, denuded local authorities of their power, their autonomy over that period of time, despite, as I say, various inquiries. And one of the crucial recommendations in Macintosh was that there should be an investigation into the financing of local government. And we've had the investigations, we've just not had the implementation. We've had various reviews. I suppose most recently the kind of local government financial review, but it just hasn't been done. And I think that's really interesting and important, that it does seem to be the case. There's not a lack of evidence, there's not a lack of ideas out there. There's just a kind of an implementation gap. Things just don't happen. So that would be my kind of broad thing. I'm sure there's much else that could be said and many other themes under that heading. But, it is striking to look back over the years, and it's very familiar kind of arguments being put forward, and just so little seems to have happened.
Okay. And David, from an English perspective?
Well, I was going to say, James, just coming in. So, it's really interesting because I'm sure that myself and many of my colleagues could tell a very similar narrative for the England experience. But there are significant differences. But I suppose the first point I was going to make, when I was preparing for this, and Paolo and colleagues sent around some really helpful notes. And one of just the first point I would like to make is, you mentioned in your notes, Paolo, particularly the Mackintosh and Christie commissions, which are both Scottish commissions. And I have to say, I haven't worked really at all in Scottish local government, but I worked in English local government extensively. And we don't know about the Mackintosh and Christie commissions. Then they're not part of the lexicon of reform narratives, which I think is an interesting point to make, that perhaps we don't spend enough time talking to each other and helping each other. I speak as a very committed decentralist and devolutionist in this process. I suppose what I would say about England, and this is a really superficial, simplistic characterization, is that local government reform over all the decades I've worked in it has been asymmetric, in that different areas do different things. And that's a massive difference with Scotland, which went for this 32 unitary council model. Secondly, it's been really piecemeal. The national government seems to turn its attention to different geographies at different periods of time. And some of them are actually pretty arbitrary in terms of why did they do Swindon and Wiltshire then, and then they're doing Norfolk and Suffolk now, and et cetera, et cetera. And C, my impression, and this does pick up a bit on what James was saying, is that it's often been very dominated by the financial equations of reform. Will it save? Will it lead to greater efficiencies? Can we manage the transition costs and so on? Rather than a much more fundamental discussion. And one of the nice things about going to Mackintosh and indeed Christie was that it did speak about what we're trying to achieve for our local communities. I think Christie spoke about prevention and integration and partnership working. And Mackintosh did speak about the need for mutual respect and for relations across the tiers towards common purposes and common ends. And I suppose my observation about England is that it's been much more technocratic and transactional. And, of course, it is ultimately always political, but not often politically for the higher purposes that really I would have liked to have seen.
Yeah, no, thanks very much.
I was just going to say, I think there's some really interesting points that David has just raised. I think the first point that I think that strikes me as really important is the lack of communication north and south of the border, and the fact that you've never heard. How dare you not have heard of the Christie Commission? I was a member of that commission. Seriously.
Apologies.
But I do think that the notion that devolved government gave us the opportunity to create laboratories of democracy where we could all learn from one another, I don't think that's happened to the extent across public services, across public policy more generally, than could have been the case. And I think there is a big case to be made that we could do with a lot more communication, a lot more learning. And in a way, the model of devolution that we've adopted, particularly in recent times, I think, has been that we in Scotland get on with our thing, and we don't really look south of the border to the extent that we could and should to learn from south of the border. Now, often it will be learning what not to do, perhaps, but also what to do. And I think that sharing is something that we haven't fully taken advantage of. I mean, when we do it, I mean, some of the debates here tend to be focused on things like mayors, and you know, it's reasonably superficial, frankly. So I do think there is a strong case for you know, over the next few years to open up these debates and learn from one another. And that is the essence of what devolution was supposed to be about. The other thing I would say is that I think I probably you can overstate the extent to which we engage in good discussions on principles and such like in Christie. That's certainly true of the commissions and inquiries. It's not been the case with respect to government. So in terms of policy making, I think it's very similar. It's much more technocratic, and it's also kind of questions about how are we able to do this? What are the transitional questions? And I think that scares government off doing anything bold or radical, and inevitably leads at best to kind of slow incremental change. So I think that while we've got these kind of inquiries and reports and such like, the practical politics of it all isn't so very different from south of the border. It has tended to be much more, frankly, government looking at very instrumentally rather than in a kind of principled way, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, very interested. Both of you talked about the need for greater discussion and sharing of ideas and experience between England and Scotland. That's something maybe I'll come back on to later on. But I want to pick up a couple of points that both of you raised. First of all, James, in terms of parity of esteem, which was one of the key recommendations from the McIntosh Commission, and to a certain extent was also reflected in the Christie Commission, can you explain why you think that's not happened in Scotland? You know, obviously more recently we've had the Verity House Agreement, and there's been issues with that as well. So maybe give some background to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Verity House Agreement really is a good example, an extreme example of where, you get a good set of ideas and proposals. I mean, if you read the Verity House Agreement, you know, there's very little to disagree with. I mean, I would have been a bit bolder, but nonetheless, it suggested a step forward towards the kind of Macintosh principles. The problem was that, you know, I remember being at the COSLA conference at which the then First Minister spoke very eloquently about the agreement and why it was important and why its implementation was important. And, you know, it was a great speech. A few weeks later, in a speech to his own party conference, however, he announces that there'd be a council tax freeze, contrary to what was in the agreement. The agreement was very clear that no policies affecting local government would be announced by central government without consultation taking account of local authorities. Now, nobody in local government was in any way party to that decision on the council tax freeze. So I think one of the things we get often is, you know, good rhetoric from government, but bad practice. And ultimately, there's not much that local government can do about this because power ultimately lies with government, with the Scottish Parliament, and effectively that means the Scottish Government. And they can ultimately do whatever they like. I think one of the problems that we've found with devolution is that the Scottish Government becomes frustrated when things don't work out as well as they expect. They make a great speech. Ministers will make a great speech. We're going to close the attainment gap in education or whatever else. And it's almost as if they think that the speech will automatically lead to improved outcomes, that there isn't a kind of a bit in between the outcomes and the speech. And that bit of implementation of policy development and all the rest that goes on, a huge amount that centrally involves local authorities and others, is kind of not taking into account sufficiently, if at all. And they get a wee bit frustrated. I think what happens is that ministers get frustrated. They see that things aren't improving, and their response tends to be the default position is to centralise and blame others, particularly local government, for not doing it right. And, how frequently have we heard First Minister's ministers say, well, I know in my local backyard things are going really well. And they kind of make policy on the assumption that everywhere is the same and that something that's maybe happening in Blair Gowrie could be applicable across the whole of Scotland. So I think there's a kind of a mindset amongst ministers that doesn't quite appreciate the complexity of delivery and implementation. That's why, the Christie Commission was focused on delivery. It was the future delivery of public services. That was the focus. And that's why we recognise the importance of greater collaboration, integration of services, prevention, getting out of those silos that we operated in. So I do think there is a bit of a problem. And the Parliament, of course, hasn't frankly helped, because MSPs, individual members of the Scottish Parliament, will be hearing complaints about the local schools, about local authority services, about the health service, and they will raise questions in Parliament, legitimately and understandably, and ministers feel obliged to do something. And that something tends to be to try to take control. But actually what they've got to understand, and I don't think this is fully understood by ministers, is that taking control in the way they've done it, to centralise, actually makes it more likely that things will go wrong. It won't improve the situation. They've got to work in partnership. And again, that theme of partnership, which was so central to the Christie Commission, I think has not really taken root. So partnership, understanding that local authorities and various other actors are hugely important if we are to improve outcomes for people. Sometimes, I'm going to be blunt here. Sometimes when I listen to parliamentary debates, it's like listening to a student debating society. We want a better world. I mean, when I teach public policy, I'm not interested in what you want. It's how you're going to achieve it. It's the how that we've not focused enough on. We get grand, eloquent speeches and wonderful rhetoric. That's fine. That's great to know that's what we want to achieve. Anybody can make a speech. I often say that ministers deliver speeches but little else. That delivery is the bit that's absent from our thinking. We've got to really get that into our mindset as we kind of move forward.
I'm sure ministers love it when you tell them that.
I'm not always popular with ministers, Levy.
No, I was just going to say, look, it's really fascinating. I liked your laboratories of democracy thing, which was attached to devolution. And I do think a lot of the principles that most academic and indeed practitioner communities know, principles around some level of fiscal autonomy, principles around place-based solutions for economic, social and environmental problems, actually around subsidiarity and localism, are all of those, we sort of know what the likely solutions are, and it really is difficult for the centre, whether it's in Whitehall or in Holyrood, to enable the sort of 100 flowers to bloom type of thing. And I mean, I hope one of the things that we can get on to discuss is something which has really been an issue in England during my career, which is what I would call the intermediate tier. The problem of the intermediate tier, that whether it's between Holyrood and 32 local authorities in Scotland, or whether it's between the UK Parliament and however many hundred local authorities, asymmetric local authorities in England, there has to be some sort of something in between which helps, if you like, mediate the types of scaling up of laboratories, if they are allowed, or which actually holds the centre to account to some extent if it's not letting go of the reins enough. And I'm really interested in sort of how it has felt for the 32 unitary local authorities having to deal with two governmental tiers over the 25, 30 years of devolution. And indeed, what lessons can be learned actually for both Scotland and England, particularly as England moves to mayoral combined authorities in the British situation? Because I could make the case, and I hope that I do get the opportunity to make it more thoroughly, that what has come out of Spending Review 25 has been the skeleton of a potential long-term England model of mayoral combined authority-led, mission-based subnational governance with integrated settlements and the potential for laboratories in different mayoral combined authorities. Now that puts pressure on the constituent members, which are English local authorities. But it also puts huge pressure on the mayoral combined authorities to negotiate settlements with Westminster and Whitehall that give them the flexibility and the versatility and the autonomy to do things, to vary national goals and national solutions. And I mean, I think one of the characteristics, this is as an observer only, James, one of the characteristics of the previous governments, the previous Conservative governments nationally, was that they increasingly tried to reach out to Scotland local authorities directly as a way of bypassing Holyrood to some extent. And that must have been incredibly resented in Holyrood. So I think there's quite a lot of learning that we could do, that we could discuss, because clearly Holyrood is not an intermediate tier in the same way that Andy Burnham and Greater Manchester are. But in terms of dealing with multi-tier alignment and multi-tier variations and localism, I think there is quite a lot of learning to be done.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one because, just before we had the Scottish Parliament, we had that major reorganisation that led to the 32 authorities. And of course, prior to that, we had the two-tier system, the regions, districts, and of course the island authorities were always single-tiered. But, abolishing the regions, I think, it was a mistake. And I think the regions, even if we had to make some amendments, I think we would have had to do so, performed a very important function. And there's no doubt they were done away with by the government. I've looked at the archives and looked at the debates inside the Scottish office. It's very clear it was party political. The regions were too powerful. They would be, could cause the Scottish office trouble. And they did. They often did. But I think the absence of a kind of a tier between the 32 authorities and the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government, is a problem. Many of these 32 authorities are frankly too small. So even if we were to give them more functions, responsibilities, it just would not make sense. So we do need to get to a kind of situation, I think, where we've got some larger authorities. Now, there is already the kind of beginning of that in some parts of Scotland, particularly in the west, in Glasgow, in the greater Glasgow area, where there is real cooperation. And I think that could be taken further by giving these kind of bodies that are emerging more powers and competencies, including fiscal powers. That would make for a big difference because I noticed today in one of the newspapers, I think it's the Herald this morning, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury has got a piece arguing that Glasgow is behind Manchester because Manchester's doing exactly what Glasgow should be doing. Now, whether that is going to be welcomed by the Scottish Government, I doubt, given the source. But we've got to try and get out of the way of looking at this from a party political point of view and actually see it in terms of how do we deliver better services. So I think if we were to move forward, we will at some point have to address the problem of scale. Now, I'm not suggesting that we want to return to the regions, but there was a lot in the regions that was very, very good. And there's certainly a case for across Scotland, larger authorities, at least for certain purposes. And it may well be the case that we could look at health and decide that some aspects of health could be brought within these larger units. And it may also be the case, and I think this would have to be done gradually over time, because I don't think there's going to be any appetite to do it any other way. Maybe some of the existing authorities are actually too large for certain functions as well. So maybe we should be kind of, decentralising and centralising, as it were, or scaling up and scaling down. With the current arrangements, I just don't think work. I think it is interesting what the Conservatives were doing, reaching over Holyrood and the Scottish Government into local authorities, and some of the local authorities understandably welcomed that because they could see that there was a wonderful incentive there. It's called money, so that they went for it, including authorities that were controlled by the same party as in government in Edinburgh. And in a way, at the end of the day, regardless of Scotland's constitutional status, decisions made in London will affect local authorities in Scotland, will affect citizens here. So we would want to take that into account. And truly, good system of devolved government or multi-level governance is one which is certainly more complex than what we had pre-devolution, but it can work. But it requires proper cooperation, and it requires the kind of respect that just has not been there. And particularly, I think, of recent times where the constitutional question, the big capital C constitutional question, has been so dominant. It's really cast a big shadow over our politics here. I sometimes think we're moving out of that shadow now, but we have to be very clear as to where we're moving to. We've really got to grasp the opportunities that exist. Now, I'm pretty sure that there are many people in local government who'll be opposed to some of this, who'll be very nervous about some of this, not least the idea of having these, if you like, city regions emerging in Scotland. Some people would feel that they might be losing out in local government if that was to happen. But I think that we need to kind of start thinking much more boldly, and particularly putting kind of delivering services, improving our economy much more centre stage than we have been. And I have to think that we need a kind of much more public policy focus rather than a constitutional focus on some of these issues in Scotland. But this is where England is interesting from a Scottish point of view, and that diversity that is in England is interesting. And the asymmetries, I don't think asymmetry is a bad thing. I mean, Scotland isn't a symmetrical society in its geography, in any sense, and that needs to be recognised. We've always recognised it with respect to the islands, but we haven't really recognised that elsewhere. It is absurd that an authority like Clackmannanshire should have the same kind of competencies in terms of local government as the city of Glasgow. So I think we've got to start thinking much more about these issues. And I think if we could in Scotland put as much energy and intellect, if we put that into these debates, as has gone into kind of the big constitutional question over the last 15 years or so, then I think we could start to really improve outcomes for citizens in Scotland.
James, a lot of really useful, interesting points in it, and it chimes in with what was David saying earlier on. I'm interested in this dichotomy between centralisation and decentralisation, and the asymmetrical or piecemeal approach in England compared to the more centralised one-tier-fits-all approach in Scotland. David, from your perspective, from an English perspective, do you think the piecemeal approach or asymmetrical approach to local government reform and reorganisation is working, or are there inherent problems in that?
Well, no, I certainly don't think it's working. But there are different types of asymmetry. I mean, I agree with James that if you believe in place-based solutions and place-based agency, then, clearly places are different, and therefore you would expect different institutional arrangements to pertain. Therefore, I'm not against an asymmetrical pattern of subnational governance. As a matter of principle. I think the piecemeal tactical approach is very damaging. So for example, what we have in England at the moment is we have a selected group of non-metropolitan county geographies being incentivized to create unitary structures of plus or minus 500,000 people, almost regardless of A, what local government is actually for going forward in the long term, B, what are the critical economic, societal and environmental challenges facing those geographies, C, what do the people actually want, D, how are you going to resource any of it? And it's self-evidently ridiculous because, as James himself said, I mean, I think I'm right in saying there are only two, which I think is Edinburgh and Glasgow, of the 32 authorities, which are over 500,000 people in Scotland. I think that's that. Apologies if I got that wrong, but very, very few very large councils in Scotland. So if you actually, as a national government, genuinely believed you needed 500,000 people in today's world to tackle these issues, you'd have to have not only local government reorganisation in a few of the shires, but you would have, in England, you'd have to have local government reorganisation throughout Scotland, Wales, and indeed the metropolitan areas. If you look at London's 32 boroughs, none of them are actually 500,000 population, or if there's only one or two. If you look at Greater Manchester, you could say the same thing. I mean, West Yorkshire, only Leeds would and Bradford might get close to the to the supposed optimum population threshold. So I think I think what is needed is probably some sort of empowered commission with a large degree of bottom-up traction, with a small number of articulated principles that they were working to come up with solutions for different geographies across the UK if we're going to remain a unitary state. And I do think, I think where James and I seem to be agreeing is, there are a small number of principles where we know it would improve things if there was more fiscal autonomy. It would improve things if subnational leaders were politically empowered. It would improve things if citizens and communities felt some agency and some ownership of the political decisions that affect their lives. So it would improve things if you could do integrated place-based working well. It would improve things. The Clackmannanshire thing is fascinating. It would improve things if our subnational tiers had the capacity and capabilities to deliver change effectively. There are a small number of things that we could probably all agree on in a 1-hour LGIU Future Lab discussion, and where we could probably get a majority of national, regional and local politicians to agree. We then need a process for actually turning those principles into practice.
Yeah. One thing I would say about Clackmannan, given that I kind of probably articulated that more bluntly than I ought to have, is that Clackmannan may be the appropriate size for some functions. It may well not need to be done away with in any shape or form. But I do think that kind of point about the population, 500,000 and so on, I mean, it just would not work if that was the sole criteria, because you'd have places like the Highlands of Scotland where, they'd be enormous local authorities, and that just wouldn't work. The intriguing thing is that historically, and this goes right the way back, certainly back to the 70s, if not before, the islands have always been treated quite differently, that the islands were given all island status, and the reforms in the 1970s. And it has kind of worked there. Now, that is interesting given the nature of the islands and the communities and the very spread out, the sparsity of population and so on. So there is something there that I think we could do with kind of taking some of that thinking and applying it across the whole of Scotland and indeed the whole of the UK. But I think the danger is if you take one single criterion and use that and say this is the model, that is a kind of symmetrical thinking, as it were, that may have some crazy asymmetrical effects. But it's to get away from that, and that's why I think David's point about the importance of the bottom up is vitally important. That we need to look at what's going on in different communities. That which is required, in Greater Glasgow is going to be different from the Highlands and Islands. And yes, Glasgow as a city, is a decent size, but there's certainly a very powerful argument that the boundaries of Glasgow are inappropriate, and for things like the economy, travel to work areas and the surrounding areas really ought to be in a Greater Glasgow area. What's interesting when you speak to people through in the west of Scotland is how many people want to be part of this Greater Glasgow conglomeration, and I can think of some local authority councillors who are not part of the current kind of informal arrangements who would love to be part of it, which is interesting. Now, having said that, there are other parts of Scotland where we've not seen anything like that development. There's not the same development, say, in Edinburgh and the Greater Edinburgh area, but it may well be the case that in the fullness of time, say Greater Glasgow was allowed to push ahead with this, that maybe there'll be a learning process and people would start to think, yeah, that is for us, or a variation is for us, say, in Edinburgh. So, Greater Edinburgh. Yeah, that's why I think it would have to be a process of change over time. I don't think that we want to go back to having a kind of royal commission or a commission that would impose a solution on Scotland. That becomes more difficult, becomes a bit more messy, but I think it would lead to a better situation in long term.
I totally agree that we shouldn't go necessarily for a big bang. I mean, maybe it could be like a standing committee or something that managed devolution, some sort of standing committee. But it's fascinating what you said about Greater Glasgow, because one of my concerns in England has often been that outside London, the other areas look at what Greater Manchester appears to have achieved and they say we must gravitate towards that model because A, that model appears to be making progress in Greater Manchester, B, government's sort of increasingly familiar with it and has confidence in it. But self-evidently, if you're in the south, if you're in Cornwall and Devon, actually you don't want that model. And I completely agree with you. I don't know Clackmannanshire, but I passionately believe in place-based solutions and community agencies. And if I take one thing that I'm working on at the moment, which is about the ongoing streeting NHS reforms. I mean, it is very clear to me, and again, like Scotland, and I'm not an NHS expert, but it is patently clear to me that if government wants to achieve its health outcomes, community health is massively important. And the proposition that you put the system through this abolition of NHS England without doing a commensurate effort at very, very local level in some geographies about community health, anxiety, mental health, loneliness, active, healthy living, which are all very local activities, is to me really, really worrying.
Absolutely. 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 I mean, to go back to the comment I made earlier about the kind of laboratories of democracy, I think one of the things is that why we should be doing that, and I think you've made the point very powerfully, David, is that we shouldn't just try and lift and paste. We should look and learn and take account of all the issues and problems that may arise from lifting and pasting, and recognising that we can take the best from elsewhere, but we must take that which is appropriate to our own area. And I think that kind of thinking is much more nuanced than the tendency that we get, I think, from those at the centre who tend to think, right, this has worked in whatever. Blair Gowrie is always my favourite example because I've heard it so often, and apply it elsewhere. It's really vitally important that we make sure that we take that which is appropriate. But you're right. Again, the complexity of it is highlighted by the fact that you do need these local, very local reforms as well. And I do think that we've got to get out of our silo thinking about there's the health over here and local government over there. That has not helped us. And I think the tendency, certainly up here, when people think about health, they think National Health Service. We now use the language of public health, but I'm not sure we really think about public health in the way we should be. And that is another area that, we kind of touched on that in the Christie Commission, the vital importance of public health and that very local set of relationships. And then the other thing, of course, which I guess we've implicitly referred to, but we haven't said so explicitly, is the third sector's involvement in all of this. The third sector is vitally important in all of this. I mean, local communities would not survive without active third sector activity.
Thanks. I was going to draw this bit of the discussion to close and move on to something else, and which you've just touched on as well. But I think from what you're both saying and the experience both things as well, is that what we need to look at is place-based solutions and local solutions, which means subsidiarity. And going back to the very first question in terms of the Mackintosh Commission and the Christie Commission in Scotland, was the subsidiarity was at the heart of what they were recommending, and maybe hasn't happened. And as you were saying, James, in terms of Scotland at least, and possibly also in England, there's been greater centralisation rather than more subsidiarity. David and yourself, James, as well, have touched on health and social care, and also there's been a lot of discussion in Scotland in terms of health and social care reform and the proposals to create a national care service modelled on the National Health Service, and now in England there's discussion about having a national care service as well. So I wanted to maybe to get your views on why reform of health and social care hasn't happened in the way it should have happened, and is that just part of centralisation, where health wants to keep control of public health, whereas, as you were saying earlier, David, public health is really a local issue. It's not really a National Health Service issue. So can you maybe touch on why you think health and social care reform hasn't happened in the way you'd wanted to happen? And going back to the finance issue, which you both touched on earlier as well, there's been a lot of discussion over recent years about council tax reform. Again, can you maybe, from your perspectives, outline why you think council tax reform hasn't happened in the way it should have happened? David, you want to kick off on the health and social care side of things?
Yeah, I mean, as I brought it up, thanks, Paolo. I can't say why it hasn't happened, but I think I can give a couple of observations. I mean, the first is, one of the things that I find really significant about the Starmer government's missions is that there are 4 missions which are clearly about socio-economic and environmental outcomes that are really important to people. And then there is a fifth mission, which is about fixing the NHS, which with the best will in the world is an institutional mission. And I think this actually does tell us a lot, about politicians' belief in the political realities of their constituencies, that the NHS being almost a British religion. But I would have much preferred a mission about health outcomes rather than it being a mission about the NHS. And I think it then clearly goes on to talk about the health experiences and the differential outcomes of different cohorts of the population. But again, it's one of these things that we all know, but we seem to find it really difficult to operationalize. We all know that far and away, the majority of health outcomes, long-term health outcomes, are determined by the wider determinants of health. Your housing, where you live, the type of work you do, the sort of household income you got, your lifestyle, your well-being, assets and resources. And the NHS is a service that has typically focused on the management of ill health. So, I mean, these are all basic stuff that we all know. And really to flip that around, again, it's probably been in the narrative for as long as I've been working, which is an awfully long time. We need to start with the wider determinants and then enable the NHS to advise, support and enable us to address some of those community issues, and sort of only come in with the intensive high spend stuff with the ill health, where there have been, if you like, problems or issues. Mm-hmm. And so what I would very much like to have seen would have been a health mission that was based on outcomes, where the NHS was required to work in partnership with the other public and indeed third sector agencies that determine the wider variance, so to speak. And until we do that, I think we're going to be quite frustrated. It is fascinating that each time, I mean, James, you had one of your earlier answers was about political pronouncements, but every time I hear a political pronouncement which actually talks about, well, we're going to provide this additional equipment in the hospitals, or this additional equipment to the digital literacy of GPs or whatever, I think, that's really great. I mean, I don't decry that. But until we start at, the sort of bottom rungs, it's going to be really difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the kind of pronouncements I particularly disfavour are the ones where it's 1,000 more X. And I always point out that anything that's 1,000 more at any round number is highly suspicious. That's designed not to address a public policy problem or issue, but to get a headline. I think, when I think of the kind of why has it been so difficult with health and social care and with local taxation, I'm kind of drawn to Paul Johnson, the Institute of Fiscal Studies director, soon to move on from that post. But he wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago, Follow the Money. And I think he provides the answer, at least implicitly, to that question. And he says that so much in terms of public policy, not just about finance, but particularly about finance, he's obviously focused on finance, but it involves really difficult decisions. It's difficult, painful decisions. There will often be unintended consequences. There will be winners and losers, and that has to be taken into account. And, governments are understandably cautious. They don't want to make anything too bold. They may make bold statements, but bold decision-making, quite rightly, I think they're cautious. But it often can lead to no decisions being made, nothing much happening, and you kind of get this inertia. there will always be these trade-offs when you make decisions. And I think those winners and losers. And the truth of the matter, when it comes to, say, local taxation, if we were to reform local taxation in Scotland, as we all know, we've not had a revaluation since 91, and even that was a pretty inadequate exercise, there will be some very significant losers. That's why I think if it was to happen as it should happen, it would have to be done over time. And we have to look at who would be the losers. The truth of the matter is that the kind of people who tend to turn out to vote, highest propensity to turn out to vote, are likely to be the people who will lose. And so from my point of view, I know seek an election, it's easy for me to say, let's do that. If you want to get returned at an election, you've got to take that into account. And unless and until we get greater consensus across the politicians and parties, then I think that's going to be very difficult to do. I think the National Care Service in Scotland, I think one of the problems is that was just a kind of a pronouncement with very little thought as to how it should be implemented. And the piece of legislation that was presented before Parliament really demonstrated it hadn't. Myself and a colleague in the law school who's an expert on drafting of legislation wrote a piece about this, especially as the legislation was moving through Parliament. I mean, at one point, the government itself was forced to make so many amendments that the original bill essentially had been ditched, and it was almost like a new bill was being put forward through Parliament. But of course, what happened then was it didn't go back to the earlier stages where you would get the kind of input from others that was required, and so we've wasted an awful lot of time on this because this tendency to not think things through, work out how you would implement it, just hasn't happened. The truth of the matter is, as we've got this growing elderly population, we have a major problem. We've got a problem in terms of general demography in Scotland, in that the kind of dependency community, the community, whether it's young people at schools and such like, or the older people who are retired, together are increasingly a larger and larger proportion of the total population. And so the population that's actually contributing to taxation is shrinking. And we've got lots of problems in that respect in Scotland as the oil and gas industry is declining. These are people who've been employed at fairly high salaries and wages. That has meant and will mean into the future that we're not going to have the same income coming through the tax base to the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government. And, we have some really troubling years ahead in this respect. So we're going to have to think a lot more imaginatively, and we're going to have to think about how to tackle some very politically difficult questions as to how this can be addressed. And I fear that nothing much is likely to happen until such time as we can get, frankly, the political parties in Scotland, or at least some of them, to work constructively together. The trouble is that if a party X, for example, says we're going to kind of have a revaluation in Scotland, parties A to Z other than X will jump up and down and oppose it because they see the opportunity from a party political point of view in doing so. So we're caught here. And that takes me back to another of the points that is made by Paul Johnson in his book. He says part of the problem is the public. He says, we demand all these things, but actually when things come forward with that could cost us money, we're not so keen on them. And so we do need to have a bit more a serious debate about the options with the public in Scotland as elsewhere, and I don't think we're doing that to the extent that's required. We've certainly got people trying to do that. We've got certainly academic communities. We've got the fiscal commissions and so on doing this, producing great reports. We've got people like Audit Scotland doing a fantastic job, frankly. But I still fear that we're not getting through. And certainly for me, I think what it highlights is that Scotland is perhaps not quite the progressive country that many of us thought it was, or would like to think it is. And we need to take that into account as we're kind of developing our thinking. So, I hate to say it, I see so many difficulties and problems, and from that point of view, I can see that, why not much might change. I do worry that what may happen is that we'll hit a crisis of some sort. I mean, it'll be not a kind of moment, but we'll move into a position where we'll be forced to make changes. Tend to find that if you do that, the changes you make are not always the best changes. So we really need to kind of be ready for the opportunity to make the kind of changes that are required. Fortunately, I think there are some good ideas out there. We've certainly been debating some of these issues, certainly on local taxation, for long enough. We've got the ideas there. It's the political will. And that's not just the politicians, that's also the public in Scotland, as I suspect across the whole of the UK.
Thanks, James. And before we finish, and we're beginning to run out of time, can I ask you both to sort of put your crystal ball thoughts on it? And from if you were Prime Minister, David, or First Minister in Scotland, James, what one or two things would you do to help local government deliver for citizens? You've touched on some of that already, but very succinctly, what's the one or two major changes, or it might be minor changes, that you think would need to be put into place to help local government deliver for its citizens? David, do you want to kick off on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be brisk as we are reaching again towards the end. I mean, I think what both James and I have sort of implicitly said all along is long-term fiscal devolution is absolutely critical. It would achieve so much if local government A, had a degree of certainty, and B, had a degree of financial muscle when it's sitting around the table with whether it's Holyrood or Whitehall or both. So for me, we need to have a process. It might be an incremental process, but we need to have a clear direction of travel towards enhanced fiscal devolution, and then everything else sort of can come from that. And in its skeletal form, I mean, I hope I do get the opportunity to write and talk a bit more about this in other forums. I do think the potential long-term England model that is implied in the Spending Review 2025. I would be absolutely fascinated, James, to have a separate discussion with you about how that play out in Scotland, because it's a huge set of questions for Scotland. But B, I think our sector, if I can call the devolution and the subnational sector a sector, our sector needs to do some serious thinking and practice and laboratory work on how we move towards long-term fiscal devolution.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with all of that. I absolutely agree with that. And I suppose the question that would follow on from this, and I'm not sure the answer at all, is the speed of change. I mean, David's right to say it's got to be long-term. I suppose if I was First Minister, I'd be wanting to go as fast as I possibly could, which would probably mean that I'd lose out and not be re-elected, that's for sure. So I think there is an issue there about the speed. I mean, we have a problem in that the longer we put this off, the more challenging it's going to be and the more we're going to have to do things very quickly. So we better start soon because we are running out of time. We really are running out of time. And if you just look at the demography in Scotland, it's very worrying. So I think the fundamental point is we've got to start. And I would very much agree with David.
Yeah, and then the second thing, sorry if I'm allowed two shots, which I did refer to earlier, is this whole issue of community agency. The whole loss of trust in political institutions, I think, can be addressed if we find ways to make localism real and to allow people to feel empowered about their local decisions that affect their future. So the two have to go hand in hand. A subnational landscape or architecture that has the muscle to speak as partners with national government and local communities who feel that they're empowered to make decisions about their lives.
Again, I could not agree more. I mean, I think one of the things about the debate in Scotland is that you tend to find there are people who want to focus on the local, and then there are people who want to focus on the kind of larger units. And it's almost as if there are two separate conversations. They ought to be brought together. I think they need to be brought together. And that in Scotland hasn't been happening. I mean, I know groups of people who are very much focused on that local dimension of the community, and I respect and agree with them. But we cannot ignore the other side of things and the need for these kind of bigger units as well. So Absolutely, that's how we've got to go. If we only go for one, then we'll fail, or at least we won't do what we need to do. It's going to be difficult, but we need to start.
Great, thanks very much, James and David. Thanks very much for joining us today, and we really appreciate your time and your insights. And it was good to get unanimity at the end in terms of what the key issues are facing the local government. The LGIU will be back soon with more expert interviews for the LGIU's Future Local Lab programme. In the meantime, please explore our website, lgiu.org, and check out Future Lab Local, where you can find more information, ideas and innovation for local government around the world. For now, thank you for listening, and James and David, thank you once again.